It began as a quiet exchange inside the private Windsor briefing room, something never meant to leave royal confidentiality. But within minutes, the mood around Catherine, Princess of Wales, shifted dramatically. Sources suggest the mention of a Diana Sapphire Set reassignment froze the entire room. And when Lady Louise Windsor's name entered the conversation, Catherine reportedly fell silent, visibly stunned, as if the past had just been rewritten in real time. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the heart of Windsor's private administrative wing, the briefing began with what was expected to be a routine discussion between Catherine, Prince William, and senior household advisors. The agenda, as sources suggest, initially centered on ceremonial planning and long-term custodianship of royal heritage pieces. Yet the atmosphere reportedly shifted the moment a senior aide referenced the Diana Sapphire Set reassignment, a phrase that carried far more weight than its procedural tone implied. Conversations slowed, papers were adjusted, and the room once orderly grew noticeably tense. William is said to have leaned forward, carefully measuring each word, while Catherine remained still, absorbing the implications without interruption. Those present describe an immediate sense that this was no ordinary administrative update, but a recalibration of something deeply symbolic within the royal inheritance structure. It was at this point that Lady Louise Windsor's name surfaced, introduced not casually, but within the context of evolving custodial arrangements tied to royal jewelry stewardship. The mention reportedly landed with unexpected force. Catherine, long associated in public perception with continuity of Princess Diana's legacy, is said to have paused entirely, her expression unreadable, her silence described by insiders as unusually absolute. Advisors quickly attempted to steer the conversation back toward procedural language, emphasizing governance protocols and internal review structures, while also urging discretion to prevent any premature leaks. Yet whispers within palace corridors suggest that this reassignment was not entirely spontaneous. Rather, it may have been the culmination of discussions quietly circulating for weeks within restricted advisory circles. By the time the briefing concluded, staff outside the room reportedly sensed a shift that no formal statement could contain. Communications teams were alerted to maintain strict narrative control, while internal Windsor operations were placed under heightened sensitivity protocols. The tension was not loud, but unmistakable, an undercurrent running through every corridor, every exchange, every avoided glance. What had begun as a controlled discussion now felt like the opening of a far larger realignment within the royal household, one that few were prepared to acknowledge openly. But the silence inside Windsor wasn't the real story. It was the hidden decision that had already been set in motion long before Catherine even entered the room. The sapphire set tied to Princess Diana has always been more than jewelry. It has been treated as a symbolic inheritance of legitimacy, memory, and royal continuity. Yet, according to palace whispers, the set's custodianship was quietly reviewed in early 2026, triggering a private reassessment of who truly carries Diana's legacy forward within the next generation of royals. What began as a quiet administrative review soon evolved into something far more delicate, rooted deeply in the emotional architecture of the monarchy itself. The sapphire pieces associated with Diana were never just decorative artifacts. They were treated as a living extension of her public identity, preserved within official royal collections and protected through layers of trust arrangements designed to prevent casual redistribution. For years, they were symbolically linked to continuity, carefully framed as part of a broader cultural inheritance that transcended individual ownership. Yet palace insiders suggest that in early 2026, a structured review of heirloom custodianship began circulating through King Charles III's household office, framed as a procedural assessment, but carrying implications far beyond paperwork. Those familiar with internal royal governance describe the moment as subtle but significant, a recalibration of oversight rather than a public decision. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had long been viewed as the natural symbolic custodian of Diana's legacy, not through formal decree alone, but through public association, emotional continuity, and generational positioning. Her presence, particularly in relation to Diana's memory, had become one of the monarchy's most stabilizing narratives. However, within the same period, attention began to shift toward the younger tier of royals, with names like Lady Louise Windsor gradually entering intern. Discussions tied to ceremonial visibility and future representation. These discussions were not framed as replacements, but as expansions of custodial symbolism, yet even subtle adjustments carried weight inside a family where legacy is measured in centuries, not years. The sensitivity surrounding the Sapphire Set intensified because of its emotional proximity to the public imagination. Diana's memory remains one of the most powerful connective threads between the monarchy and the people, and any perceived movement around her possessions is treated with extreme caution. Palace advisors, according to sources close to the process, were acutely aware that even internal review language could spark interpretations of shifting loyalties or redefined hierarchies. As a result, the 2026 reassessment was conducted under heightened confidentiality, with limited visibility even among senior household staff, reinforcing the sense that something structurally important was being examined beneath the surface. Within this atmosphere of controlled discretion, the idea of custodianship itself began to blur, no longer just about possession, but about representation, timing, and generational signaling. What appeared on paper to be a routine review of heirloom stewardship instead became a quiet referendum on symbolic inheritance, forcing the institution to confront how legacy is both preserved and redistributed in a modern monarchy still anchored in tradition. However, what looked like a symbolic review soon revealed itself as something far more disruptive, a shift that no one inside the palace expected to escalate so quickly. According to palace-adjacent sources, the reassignment was not gradual, it was immediate. In what insiders describe as a procedural override, Lady Louise Windsor was quietly positioned as the temporary custodian of the Diana Sapphire Set for a scheduled royal showcase. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was reportedly not consulted in the final confirmation, triggering a wave of internal shock across Kensington circles. What makes the moment so striking is not just the decision itself, but the speed and silence with which it was executed. Within the structured machinery of royal administration, changes to heirloom custodianship are typically layered, reviewed, and softened through consultation. Yet in this case, palace whispers suggest the usual rhythm was disrupted. A single directive routed through the Royal Collection Management Office appears to have bypassed the informal expectation of consensus. Courtiers later described it as legally grounded but emotionally misaligned, a phrase that captured the growing tension between institutional procedure and personal symbolism. Lady Louise Windsor's name entering this equation added another unexpected dimension. Known for maintaining a low public profile, her sudden placement in a custodial role tied to one of Princess Diana's most emotionally significant sets created immediate ripple effects. In the palace circles, the assignment was framed as ceremonial rather than permanent, yet symbolism in the monarchy is never neutral. Every role, every placement carries weight far beyond its administrative label. And this weight, according to insiders, was felt most sharply in Kensington Palace, where Catherine's exclusion from the final confirmation reportedly created a moment of profound stillness, one that staff interpreted not as protest, but as processing. The timing of the decision only deepened the sense of unease. It coincided with an internal restructuring of heirloom management protocols, a broader initiative quietly moving through King Charles III's household office. Officially, these adjustments were meant to modernize custodial clarity and ensure transparent rotational stewardship of royal artifacts. Unofficially, however, they opened space for reinterpretation, space where legacy, memory, and representation could be subtly reallocated without overt announcement. It was within this space that the reassignment appeared to take shape, away from public scrutiny and beyond the usual channels of consultation. Catherine's absence from the final decision loop became the focal point of internal conversation. Courtiers, while careful in language, described the move as unexpected but legally grounded, emphasizing that procedure had been followed even if emotional alignment had not. That distinction between legality and sentiment began to define the emerging fracture. For a royal household built on continuity and symbolic balance, the perception of exclusion can carry as much weight as formal authority. As the news filtered through internal communication lines, confusion spread quietly but persistently. Some aides attempted to frame the reassignment as a routine scheduling adjustment for an upcoming showcase, while others acknowledged that the optics had already escaped containment. Reports suggest that advisory input linked to Princess Anne's administrative network may have influenced aspects of the decision, though no direct confirmation was ever made public. Still, even the suggestion of her structured oversight introduced a different tone, one rooted in discipline, protocol, and institutional control rather than sentiment or legacy attachment. By the time palace communications teams began coordinating responses, the narrative had already fragmented internally. What was meant to be a controlled procedural update had instead become a symbolic fault line, exposing how quickly carefully balanced roles could shift under the weight of unseen decisions. But behind the formal language of custodianship lay a deeper fracture, one that began to reshape alliances inside the monarchy itself. Witness accounts describe Catherine's reaction not as dramatic but controlled, silent, and deeply affected. In the moment Lady Louise's role was confirmed, she reportedly paused for several seconds without response. Those familiar with palace dynamics suggest this NC carried more weight than any public statement ever could, signaling a private rupture in expectations surrounding Diana's legacy. Inside the room, the atmosphere reportedly tightened in a way that no one could ignore. There was no outburst, no visible confrontation, only a stillness that settled across the discussion like a heavy curtain. Catherine, Princess of Wales, known publicly for composure under pressure, is said to have absorbed the confirmation in a way that shifted the emotional temperature of the entire exchange. Those present describe it as a moment where conversation did not stop, but rather lost its natural rhythm. Words continued, explanations were offered, but the center of gravity had already moved elsewhere. For Catherine, the emotional weight was not tied merely to procedure or hierarchy, but to something far more symbolic: the long-standing association between her public role and the memory of Princess Diana. Over time, that connection had become an unspoken pillar of continuity within the monarchy's modern image. Yet in this moment, insiders suggest that pillar felt unexpectedly recontextualized. Not removed, not broken, but reframed in a way that demanded immediate internal adjustment. And that adjustment, according to palace observers, was visible not in movement, but in stillness. William, recognizing the shift before anyone else acknowledged it aloud, reportedly attempted to stabilize the internal tone of the discussion. His approach, described by aides as measured and deliberately grounding, focused on redirecting attention back to procedural framing and institutional clarity. But even that effort could not fully restore the earlier balance. The conversation continued, yet it had become cautious, almost restrained, as if every sentence now carried unintended weight. In royal environments, where language is carefully calibrated, even slight emotional deviation can reshape the entire direction of a discussion. Staff later noted that the room itself seemed to change temperature after the confirmation of Lady Louise Windsor's custodial role. It was not hostility that defined the moment, but disorientation, a recalibration of expectations that had not been publicly announced, yet was instantly felt. Catherine's prior positioning as a symbolic bridge to Diana's legacy, once assumed, rarely questioned, was now, in subtle but undeniable ways, being re-examined through institutional eyes. And that re-examination created an undercurrent of uncertainty that no single clarification could fully resolve. What made the situation more delicate was not only what was said, but what was left unspoken. Advisors carefully avoided direct emotional language, relying instead on procedural explanations and institutional phrasing. Yet within those controlled exchanges, a growing awareness emerged. Communication channels inside the broader royal structure were not aligned. Interpretations were diverging faster than they could be corrected, and so on. Particularly Catherine's silence was beginning to speak louder than any official narrative. By the time the meeting moved toward conclusion, nothing had been outwardly disrupted, yet everything had shifted internally. The structure remained intact, but the emotional framework beneath it had subtly realigned, leaving behind questions that no one in the room seemed prepared to answer immediately. Yet even Catherine's reaction was only the surface of a far deeper institutional recalibration already underway. As word of the reassignment spread internally, senior royal figures began repositioning themselves. Sources suggest Princess Anne and Prince William's advisory circle moved quickly to contain emotional fallout and reassert procedural control. What emerged was not chaos but a calculated restoration of institutional order under strict protocol interpretation. The response inside the royal machinery was swift, precise, and deliberately unemotional. According to palace-adjacent echo, Unsis, Princess Anne's administrative influence became immediately visible in the way internal communications were restructured. The focus shifted away from interpretation and sentiment and back toward governance clarity. Every message, every briefing note, every internal clarification began to reflect a single overriding priority: stabilize the narrative through procedure, not perception. In this environment, emotion was not engaged with, it was managed, compartmentalized, and carefully redirected. At the same time, Prince William's household is said to have adopted a parallel strategy centered on containment. Not containment in the dramatic sense, but in the disciplined, almost surgical control of information flow. Advisors reportedly reviewed internal messaging channels with heightened scrutiny, ensuring that no fragmented interpretation of the reassignment could escape into uncontrolled circulation. The priority was no longer explanation, it was alignment. Everyone inside the community, Katai and Chain, was expected to speak in the same procedural language, reinforcing consistency over emotion. This shift also marked a renewed emphasis on protocol accuracy, a phrase that began appearing repeatedly in internal guidance discussions. It reflected a subtle but significant change in tone. Decisions were to be understood as administrative outcomes rather than emotional developments. Even the language used to describe the situation was carefully recalibrated, reframing the reassignment not as a symbolic disruption, but as a structured ceremonial rotation within the broader framework of heirloom stewardship. In doing so, the institution attempted to strip away narrative volatility and replace it with procedural neutrality. Behind the scenes, royal communications offices tightened their external posture. Statements were not released, but messaging discipline was reinforced across all levels of staff interaction. Even informal conversations were approached with caution, as the awareness of sensitivity around Diana-associated legacy items made every word potentially significant. Internal guidance reportedly emphasized restraint, consistency, and above all, avoidance of speculative framing. The objective was clear: prevent emotional interpretation from becoming public narrative. Meanwhile, scrutiny of heirloom governance procedures intensified quietly within advisory circles. What had initially appeared as a singular custodial adjustment began to expose broader questions about how legacy items are assigned, rotated, and symbolically represented across generations. Yet even as these questions surfaced internally, they were not allowed to destabilize the outward posture of control. Instead, they were absorbed into a structured review environment, contained within institutional language that prioritized order over ambiguity. Through it all, the monarchy's internal hierarchy was subtly but unmistakably reinforced. Not through declarations, but through procedural guidelines. The quiet reassertion that decisions, once made through proper channels, would stand regardless of external interpretation. Personal expectation, even at the highest emotional levels, was gradually recast as secondary to institutional continuity. But while the palace sought order, public curiosity and internal unease continued to intensify beneath the surface. Within hours, the decision reportedly reverberated across the wider royal household. Staff across multiple estates, including Windsor, Sandringham, and Kensington, began circulating fragmented interpretations of the change. The reassignment of the Diana Sapphire Set was no longer a private matter, it had become a symbolic test of hierarchy, memory, and future influence. The effect was immediate and uneven, spreading through the royal network like a ripple that could not be contained at its source. At Windsor, aides who were normally accustomed to rigid clarity found themselves parsing incomplete briefings, each version slightal. Why different from the last? In Sandringham, where institutional tradition often holds greater weight than rapid reinterpretation, the discussion took on a more cautious tone, with staff quietly questioning whether this marked a precedent or an exception. Meanwhile, in Kensington, the reaction carried a sharper emotional edge, as those aligned closely with Catherine's household began to interpret the shift not just as administrative adjustment, but as something that touched the deeper architecture of symbolic trust within the monarchy. As these fragmented interpretations spread, informal speculation began to outpace official clarity. Conversations behind closed doors increasingly revolved around long-term custodianship rules, not just for the Sapphire Set itself, but for what it represented in the wider ecosystem of royal heirlooms. The central question was no longer about a single assignment, it was about whether the framework governing legacy artifacts was quietly being redefined in Raya, time. And in a system where precedent is everything, even the smallest perceived deviation carried amplified significance. This sensitivity was magnified by the emotional gravity surrounding anything connected to Princess Diana. Her legacy, already deeply embedded in public consciousness, functioned within the institution as both heritage and responsibility. Every mention of her name in relation to royal artifacts triggered heightened awareness, as though the memory itself demanded careful handling. As a result, even procedural adjustments became emotionally charged, interpreted through layers of public expectation, historical memory, and internal hierarchy. Within this atmosphere, a comparative analysis of generational roles began to surface informally among staff and advisors. Conversations subtly contrasted established senior figures with younger members of the royal family, not in terms of authority, but in terms of symbolic visibility and evolving representation. It was within his context that attention increasingly turned toward Lady Louise Windsor, whose sudden association with custodial responsibility added an unexpected dimension to an already complex narrative. Her name, previously peripheral in such discussions, now appeared at the center of interpretive speculation. At the same time, Catherine's position was being reassessed in quieter, more cautious terms by those observing the internal response. Among her supporters within the wider royal network, there was a growing sense that the reassignment carried implications beyond procedure, reading it instead as a symbolic shift in emphasis rather than a simple rotation. While no formal language supported this interpretation, perception itself had become a driving force, shaping how decisions were understood regardless of intent. To manage this expanding web of interpretation, palace structures reportedly doubled down on restraint, reinforcing the long-standing position of no official statement. Silence, in this context, was not absence but strategy. It was an attempt to prevent fragmented narratives from hardening into accepted versions of events. Yet the very absence of clarification only intensified speculation, allowing each estate, each staff corridor, and each internal conversation to construct its own version of meaning. And as interpretations multiplied, one figure remained notably central to the final direction of the decision. According to palace-adjacent commentary, the final framing of the decision is believed to have been endorsed through King Charles III's administrative chain. While not publicly addressed, the move is interpreted as part of a broader restructuring of symbolic inheritance within the monarchy during a period of medical vulnerability and institutional transition. Within the quiet architecture of royal governance, the weight of such an endorsement is never expressed directly, it is carried through layers of administration, refined through council, and finally, absorbed into procedure without announcement. In this case, insiders suggest that what appeared externally as a localized custodial adjustment was, internally, treated as part of a far wider recalibration of how legacy is distributed across generations. Not through rupture, but through gradual redefinition. Not through confrontation, but through controlled continuity. At the center of this recalibration lies a persistent institutional tension. How to preserve the emotional gravity of Princess Diana's legacy while simultaneously accommodating the monarchy's evolving generational structure. For decades, Diana's symbolic presence has functioned as a stabilizing emotional bridge between the institution and the public. Any adjustment tied to her memory is therefore not just administrative, it is interpretive, reshaping how continuity itself is understood. Within this context, the administrative chain attributed to King Charles III's oversight is seen less as a single directive and more as a reinforcing mechanism, ensuring that legacy remains distributed according to long-term institutional design rather than individual expectation. Those familiar with internal advisory logic describe the shift as a move towards structured custodianship protocols, a framework designed to minimize ambiguity around symbolic assets while reinforcing procedural neutrality. In practice, this means reducing the influence of personal association in favor of rotational or representational logic, even when emotionally significant artifacts are involved. It is a subtle but powerful transition, one that prioritizes stability over sentiment and continuity over attachment. Within such a system, even the most sensitive heirlooms are repositioned as part of a managed institutional ecosystem rather than fixed emotional anchors. At the same time, care has reportedly been taken to ensure that these internal recalibrations do not spill into public controversy. Palace strategy, according to Commentary Close. To administrative circles has consistently leaned toward containment through silence rather than expansion through explanation. The goal is not to justify each adjustment in public, but to preserve institutional neutrality by avoiding narratives that could fracture perception. In this way, absence of statement becomes a deliberate instrument of control, allowing the monarchy to absorb change without external escalation. Yet beneath this disciplined surface lies a quieter balancing act between honoring historical memory and preparing for generational transition. Diana's legacy, once anchored primarily in continuity through familiar custodianship, is now being reframed within a broader spectrum of representation that includes younger members of the royal household. This does not erase the past, but it redistributes its symbolic weight, ensuring that no single figure carries its entirety unchallenged into the future. What remained, however, was the emotional reality behind the institution. The human silence that followed the decision. By the time the news stabilized internally, the monarchy had already entered a new symbolic phase. Lady Louise Windsor's temporary custodianship of the Diana Sapphire Set was framed as procedural, but within royal circles, it was understood as something more profound, a subtle redefinition of legacy stewardship in a changing crown. What emerged in the aftermath was not a reversal or correction, but a quiet normalization of the decision. Officially, palace messaging leaned heavily into the language of rotation and procedure, carefully reinforcing the idea that royal artifacts move through structured custodianship as part of long-established governance practices. Yet beneath that calm surface, those within the institution recognized the deeper implication. This was no longer just about one set of sapphires, but about how symbolic inheritance itself was being rebalanced across a new generation of royals. Every phrase used in internal briefing GS carried a deliberate restraint designed to ensure continuity remained the dominant narrative, even as interpretation outside those walls grew increasingly layered. Within this reframing, the Diana Sapphire Set became more than a historical artifact. It transformed into a reference point for a wider debate unfolding quietly inside the monarchy. Questions of legacy, visibility, and generational placement began orbiting around it, not through public declaration, but through subtle adjustments in how roles were discussed and understood. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was not removed from this symbolic architecture, but her position was carefully recontextualized, shifting from assumed continuity to interpreted continuity. That distinction, though subtle in language, carried enormous weight in perception, altering how her connection to Diana's legacy was internally discussed without ever being formally challenged. At the same time, Lady Louise Windsor's emergence into this narrative was read with equal caution and intention. Her custodianship role, described publicly in procedural terms, was internally viewed as part of a broader visibility strategy for the next generation of royals. Not as elevation in the traditional sense, but as structured introduction and incremental positioning within the institution's long-term symbolic ecosystem. In a monarchy where every public association carries historical consequence, even temporary assignments can signal future trajectories, and this moment was no exception. Her name, once peripheral in such discussions, now carried a new contextual weight that few inside the institution could ignore. Through all of this, the underlying priority remained unchanged: continuity. The monarchy's internal machinery continued to emphasize controlled legacy flow, ensuring that each adjustment, no matter how emotionally interpreted externally, remained anchored in procedural framing internally. Palace silence on emotional readings was not accurate. It was strategic, reinforcing a long-standing principle that interpretation should not outrun institution. By refusing to engage publicly with sentiment, the structure preserved its ability to evolve without overt disruption, even when those changes were deeply felt within its own ranks. Still, despite this carefully maintained equilibrium, those close to the situation acknowledge that tensions have not fully dissipated. They have simply moved beneath the surface, absorbed into the architecture of routine, where they now exist as quiet undercurrents rather than visible fractures. The system appears stable, but it is a stability built on recalibration rather than resolution, where every symbolic adjustment subtly reshapes the balance without announcing it. And in that silence between tradition and transition, the crown once again proved that its most powerful decisions are never announced, only absorbed into history. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.